We are in for a treat. We have a pretty powerful dynamic duo coming up, and we're going to go from burritos to banking. And, it's not only just flashy creative that turns heads or changes public opinion or perception among important issues. When a company goes through a crisis, having a master communicator in charge can make all the difference in changing the conversation. And we're going to welcome to the stage in a minute Anne Finucane and Andrew Ross Sorkin for our next session. They'll be up here in a second. But Anne is the Global Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer of Bank of America. She's widely known as probably one of, if not the most powerful woman in banking. She also certainly is widely known as one of the most influential women in marketing communications. Andrew Sorkin, as many of you know, is a columnist for the New York Times. He is a founder and editor-at-large of DealBook. He also is co-anchor on CNBC's Squawk Box each day. And he is the esteemed author of Too Big to Fail: How Wall Street and Washington Fought to Save the Financial System and Themselves. So we're in for a treat with the two of them, bantering back and forth. So Andrew and Anne, come on out. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us and for being here. We are going to, this is going to be a little unusual because I think we're going to ask each other questions. We're going to try to turn it into a chat about your world.
We all have questions about you.
Well, and I have questions about you.
Okay.
So we're gonna sort of go back and forth for a little bit, looking at the world of marketing and also through the world of journalism and how those two connect. But why don't we start here, which is to say that we are coming up this September, will be the 7-year anniversary, if you will, if you go back to the financial crisis of 2008. And it has been a long slog, not just for your company, but for the entire financial industry. And I thought it would help if we could start by trying to explain to us how you have thought about reputation and sort of how you've even decided to approach it and what you think the goal is supposed to be.
Well, as you can imagine, we don't like to celebrate the anniversary of a crisis, but this industry was in so much difficulty, and it took a much longer time to come out of it than one would have hoped. The recession seemed to come upon us very quickly. I know everybody retrospectively has some anecdote about how they knew, but whether you're talking about regulators, administrators, elected officials, CEOs of banks, it seemed to be something that wasn't portended, and certainly not the magnitude of it. And then we found ourselves, as many people in this room will have found, that you hit a crisis and it lingers much longer than you meant it to. In our case, we went into the financial crisis uniquely without some of the burdens other banks had. We didn't have an investment bank and we didn't have a mortgage company, and within months we had both. And we were really challenged with Countrywide particularly. So it took us a very long time. In order to keep the relationship going with customers, and we have 50 million of them, we had to do some nuts and bolts things even as we were simultaneously trying to settle the issues, rebuild our reputation. So it's talking to elected officials, it's talking to employees, it's talking to local editorial boards about how much you lend. In our case, this is what we do for a living, how much you lend, what kind of employment you provide in the area, what kind of philanthropy to get you through to the other side. And then you start back on, you go from a local market, some pretty traditional marketing, traditional communications, to much more interactive as time went on.
Are banks supposed to be loved? Are consumers supposed to love the banks? And the reason I ask is I wonder whether the period of the 80s and 90s, where Wall Street to some degree was lionized, whether that was, and people want, a hedge fund manager became Michael Jordan, if you will. People wanted to, that's where they wanted to go. Whether that's an aberration of history or that is effectively the goal. So in terms of where the goalpost becomes again for a firm like Bank of America, and the way you want the customer to think and interact with the bank?
Well, I don't think banks have ever been beloved, and I think that even when it's a paradox, they may be lionized, but they're also run into great difficulty. Bonfire of the Vanities or Man in Full. I mean, you see, there's another side to that story always. I think we aren't loved, but we're necessary, and we create value. And the idea for financial services is constantly trying to demonstrate value. And in order to demonstrate value, you got to simplify the company. It has to be more transparent, and then you have to communicate in a new world.
Let me ask you one more question on this tact. When you think about the various campaigns that you've endeavored to pursue, and you've consolidated the agencies you use, but there are still lots of them.
Yes.
Is it various campaigns, or is there something that has to run through each one of them, which is to say that you're trying to reach people who are seeking mortgages, you're trying to reach people who want credit cards, you have the government to contend with, you have the sort of influencer set that you're trying to contend with, you have different brands, you have Merrill Lynch as a bank, you have U.S. Trust, which for higher end customers. How do you think about trying to reach all of those different constituencies, and does it have to have a single message?
I think it's a single message, a single purpose or positioning. For us, it's helping people with their financial lives through the power of every connection. Now, that's something you say, and that's something you have to do. We lend $900 billion a year. I mean, that's of value to people. We take in about $1 trillion of deposits. So use us as a proxy for financial services. We have lots of constituencies. We got to demonstrate value to all of them. The value of creating something betterment of your financial life is going to be different for a mass market customer than a international company. But in each case, the people have to be good, the products have to be good, you have to deliver with excellence, you have to be more transparent. In our case, this industry, we had to reduce the amount of products we had, they had to be simpler, they had to be of value, and you had to be able to explain them, whether it's a credit card or a complicated deal, to your client, to your employees, to regulators, to people like you, the press, and to elected officials. So our constituency is so broad that we really have to, we think of reputation through the lens of each of those people, outside in.
Okay, so what has worked, and perhaps more importantly for this group in terms of lessons, what hasn't worked?
Well, what hasn't worked is being overly optimistic and thinking that things would get better quicker, because they didn't. So that didn't work. What did work is getting real, recognizing even as we tried to fix the company, which we had to do, we had to sell up, $50 billion worth of non-core assets, our involvement in other banks, our investments in other banks. So we had to simplify the company. We had to be honest with ourselves. We had to take the product set, in the case of consumer checking accounts, from 30 to 6, from credit cards from 18 to 8, and then make sure that we're testing, and we test with 3 million people a year, research, how are we doing? What would be better?
And how do you play against us, the journalists,
press,
in
yeah.
that there have been, for better or worse, headlines that have involved your firm, as there have been so many other firms over the past 7 years, virtually every day.
Right.
And oftentimes the headline is negative. And so you're playing against this sort of tough headline.
Oftentimes?
Oftentimes. You want me to say always?
I think always.
And so you're playing against these tough headlines, if you will.
Right.
And do you advertise at the same time? I remember there was a period where I think you guys decided you were not going to advertise, or you were going to keep your head down.
Right.
Then I felt like there was a period where you're doing a lot of direct stuff, some online, some out. How did you think about that period? And how do you think about sort of the news and what we do versus what you have to do?
Well, I think the headlines are there every day. For our companies and for other industries, I mean, it just seems that's the nature of news. Just to talk about news for a minute, it isn't just, it used to be that we had to worry about the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or what was on CNBC. Now it's much more pervasive. So you go into this economic tsunami, you come out, the world is really different. I mean, Twitter, I think, was 2009, so that's post crisis. YouTube and Facebook really took off in this period of time. So the multiplicity of outlets that are reporting on you and the iterative nature of reporting, I mean, Bloomberg's reporting every second, that's what's made it so difficult, because to whom do you respond? You may have talking points, but it's not like the old days. I can't call you and say, hey, I have an issue with this, and you consider whether you would do something about it.
And so what's the answer? How do you respond? Do you have a team, for example, that is jumping on Twitter the second somebody says something?
Yeah.
That's not so great?
Well, no, it's not about not so great. So what we have is we engage with everything. And it's actually been pretty good, because so Twitter for us is good because we're a little less concerned about you, we're more concerned about the customer, and if the customer has a complaint, we can intercept that right away. We can do the same thing with Facebook, and we do. I mean, banks are, if you have 50 million customers, half of them, more than half, are online. For us, about 17 or 18 million of them are on mobile, that you do all your stuff on a smartphone. You deposit your checks, you check your balances, you transfer money, you pay a bill. So that's what we care about more, that it doesn't have a disassociative feeling for our customers. What you do, I mean, we try to correct it, but the most important audience we have is our employees. If we can talk to our employees about what is and isn't true, and they can then be ambassadors for us, that helps. We have 230,000 people, that helps. Because we can't always refute what you said. You're sometimes just stating a fact, it's just negative. If we had a almost $17 billion settlement with the Department of Justice, hard to put a good spin on that.
Do you think all of that's over, by the way? How long do you think whatever's going on in Washington and the sentiment of this country, do you think it's changing for the better for the financial world? Do you think it's getting worse? Do you think it's become political? What do you think of all of this?
Well, I don't think it's as polarizing as it was. It was us and them for a long period of time. The banks, what was wrong with the banks, everything that was wrong with the banks that was constantly reported on. I do think these big fines and legal cases and Department of Justice kind of stuff that the industry went through, I think that's largely over. So we're through that. 2, we have unemployment rates that are getting to be close to 5%. That's good. So real wages and real employment are improving. Banks are lending. I told you that we lend almost $1 billion, almost $1 trillion this past year. So I think as we get better at our job, which is lending, financing, investing, and we do, and we're more transparent at it, and we demonstrate some humility, that is all good.
What do you think of millennials, and how does the bank want to reach millennials? Millennials supposedly don't like, well, most traditional things, let alone banks. And you hear about all sorts of upstarts and startups in Silicon Valley and other things that are trying to sort of upend the traditional banking model.
Well, they're upending payments, the use of a credit card, the use of a debit card, with Apple Pay, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, banks move money, and so we're necessary. Millennials use Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase or Wells Fargo as much as anybody, because they still need access to their money. I think what is different is what value do we provide. So mobile banking, being able to deposit your check with your phone, the use of Twitter, intersecting you if you had a complaint, the use of Facebook, the amount of work that we do online, that's important to millennials. And also this thing that this initiative we began, Better Money Habits. So Better Money Habits is this initiative with Salkhan. And Salkhan is, I think, the best at online education. Banks should be able to do good financial literacy, but financial literacy is, you know, a snore. Who cares about financial literacy? What you do want is some basic stuff. So we worked with him, and we've had a great deal of success with this Better Money Habits. It's an online site. It's, if you go there, Sal does the videos, and we sort of help. And it's everything. It's not just how to buy a house, how to fix your credit score. It's the anatomy of a paycheck. Because especially for millennials, the first job you get, the first paycheck, you thought you were getting $1,000 a week, and how come I am only taking home $585? That explains it. So those are the kinds of things we do.
How did that happen, the Salkhan project?
Common sense, we called them. I mean, we knew that any research in any common sense would tell you that people want to know more about their money. They became very insecure about money during the recession, and they expected us to be able to help. How can we help best? We try to do it through the products, services, the people that work there. But this really, through a little research and some common sense, we called him. He was game. We did it.
Right. How do you think about the distinction between the impact of print, online, social, live events?
Well, you think, actually, I think, and they just spoke about it even on the Chipotle case. I think we all think about it as, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is our purpose? What is our positioning? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And you use all of those as tools, all of them. Print, not so much. Print, unless it's online, we use very little of print, and I would guess that very few people in the room use print, which brings me to my question for you. You're in the newspaper business.
I'm in the news business.
Well, you're also in the newspaper business. I mean, you write for a newspaper. It matters.
One of our mediums.
Okay.
Get the news out.
Or one of yours.
Yes.
But a newspaper has to be a going concern to employ you and the 27 people that work for you on DealBook.
Right.
Their print advertising is going down. They're doing a lot more live events, online, digital. How does that affect journalism, or does it affect journalism? Are you indifferent to the fact that ad sales could be diminished?
Oh, I think, I think there was a come to Jesus moment at the New York Times, and for me, probably even before, maybe even the broader set had this view that we had to be indifferent to the actual medium with which we were delivering the news. DealBook as a creation started as an email newsletter, in a way as an end run around the physical newspaper. I was finding that I didn't think enough of my sources, and a lot of the people that I cared about on Wall Street were reading the Times, and so we wanted to figure out how do we fix that? We're going to do it digitally. We're going to get inside their email box. That was originally how it started. So I don't think there's a particular care about how the news is delivered in terms of the actual physical product. But I think what we've realized over time is, if you really look, I mean, most of the growth at the New York Times now is mobile. I mean, I think it truly is a mobile platform. And I think in 5 years from now, that's how most of us will participate with the paper. I don't think the physical paper is going away, and I think the impact, by the way, of the paper, I am still convinced that if you are flipping the pages and you land on an ad or a story, that the impact of that it can physically have on you and your interaction with it is still greater than just about anything. You may disagree.
I don't think so.
You may disagree with that. I think there are less people reading it, but I think that when you actually land there, the visceral experience that you have with it is fundamentally different than so many other mediums. And I think one of the other things we've done is get into the events business. DealBook started early with the conferences. You guys were an early sponsor of what we're doing. And the idea of being able to convene the equivalent of a mini Davos for a day, where you have the major leaders of every different company that's represented in the world of finance, whether it be Lloyd Blankfein or Mary Barra from General Motors, or Adam Silver from the NBA, or Ken Chenault from American Express, or whomever, and put them all in one room, I think is an extraordinary opportunity, not just for the people who are in the room, but then for us to take that content, and this goes to the idea of content and the medium, and then be able to push that content out all over again. So to me, that's just another version of sort of live journalism. The medium unto itself isn't necessarily the end goal.
Right, but for all the brands in this room, what happens is you report in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, but there's a constant update, whether it's through your own online or people retweeting and then adding comment. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that? Because you don't, how much time do you have to think? You have to be on top of the news, you have to be with breaking news, and it constantly seems to be breaking. And then there are the aggregating sites and.
So there's good and bad news in all of this, but and obviously I'm biased. I'm a child of the New York Times. Clearly, it's become a much more competitive environment. I mean, terrifically more competitive in many ways. Having said that, we are now competing, as you said. It used to be I was competing against the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and maybe some of the wire services and TV networks. And now I'm competing to some degree against Twitter and TMZ. And so that's changed the dynamic because it's forced everybody to up their metabolism, which I think is a good thing. But I think in a world where all of us have become our own reporters, if you will, and we are all deciding that we're triangulating news, I would argue for any piece of news that anybody in this room is actually interested in, you probably go to 3 or 4 sites to read the exact same piece of news, and you're trying to come up with your own version of the truth. I think the role that the New York Times plays in all of this is actually that it can be the baseline. I think actually a lot of people go to those 4 or 5 sites reading about the different pieces of news, some of which is credible and some of which is not at all, and then you come back to the Times and you go, that's what it really is.
But that's what you hope is happening. But I mean, it's the paper of record. That's great, but it's just that for brands, there's just so much news about any brand at any given time. We've got to interact with all of that, and we've got. So to your earlier point, we're communicating by talking to our employees through Twitter, through Facebook ourselves, because you're trying to at least get as much information out yourselves as you're reporting on it.
Well, I would argue that one of the things that the internet, if you will, has done is actually has allowed you to become a news organization. I don't know if it's a news organization so much as it used to be that you sent your press release out and that then we actually had to contend with the release and you had to deal with our
or ignore it
or right, but you had at some level you were dealing with our interpretation of the release.
Right.
Now you can go direct to consumer, if you will.
Do you think,
and so what does that do to the news organization? I still believe, actually even more so today, that in an age where people are inundated with your press release or a website that you've created, they want to see that news, and they'll take that news, but then they want to see the interpretation of that.
Fair enough. So speaking of that, the interpretation of that, do you think that, I'll use the New York Times, we could use another publication. What is the relationship with big business? How do you see big business? How do you see big brands? In other words, do you feel that your news can really be objective, or is there a bias? Is there when it's a story about a large financial institution or a big consumer goods company or a car company, can you be truly objective?
Okay, so I'm going to get in trouble for saying this.
Good.
So I like to think of myself as somebody who really is objective. I am the person who will, like to write when somebody does something wrong. I'll write that, and I will also give you an attaboy if you do the right thing. I think broadly speaking,
I think I must have missed that.
You missed the attaboy. I think broadly speaking, journalists and journalism today, and I would argue Twitter is part of this, and the comments that you see on sites are part of this. There is, by default, to some degree, a bias against big business. I mean, look, one of the phrases in journalism, which I actually don't agree with to some degree, is afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. I'm of the view that journalists should afflict those who afflict others and comfort the afflicted. But I do think that there is much more, as a journalist, you will get much more kudos by speaking truth to power and writing a tough investigative piece about a powerful figure, whether they be, by the way, in business or politics or what have you, than you will necessarily in the attaboy. Now, as a result, I would say one of the things we miss oftentimes, especially in a post-crisis world, and this happened post-Enron as well, is we actually miss the good stories, meaning there are great companies and great organizations, upstarts and the like, where we are too afraid to even acknowledge what's going on because we're worried that another problem is going to occur and we will then be burnt. Because that's happened before. So there is this back and forth in terms of that dynamic a little bit.
Right, but the exception can't define a company, and that's
Right.
often what companies find, that
Very tough.
that the news business only really reports on the exception, on your. Nobody wants to
if
be
it bleeds, it leads, right? And I
And-
think I think that functionality is worse as a function of Twitter and of social media, and because if you really were to look through the comments on so many of these stories, and on Twitter, as you know, it's much more negative than it's positive. People are not rewarding the positive, and I think that's actually one of the great challenges that journalists face to some degree.
But they don't want to.
Not to say we shouldn't be doing the tough investigative stories. I think that there's a huge value to the national discourse about doing those pieces. But
So you're a brand. I mean, you have 500,000 Twitter followers. You have DealBook. You have Squawk Box. You have a best-selling book. You have an upcoming series. How do you deal with that? You're reporting on the news, and you are, in a way, your own news.
it makes it.
Andrew.
Thank you. I try not to think about it, first of all, but it makes it easier and tougher in some ways. It makes it easier in that all of those things you just discussed actually feed each other. So it's very often where I will learn about something working on Squawk that then factors into something I'm going to do in my column in the New York Times, or something that I'm going to do in my column in the New York Times that's going to wind its way up back on television in some way, or in a fictional setting, or whatever it is. So that's the good news. The bad news is that I have friends who will tweet out when they're going to the bathroom. I won't do that because I know that there's so many people who are actually watching and listening, and so I'm much more, frankly, anxious about what I write, and I'm much more conscious that everything I write will get dissected, often, by the way, in a negative light.
Right.
So I get the joke on that too. In a way, I would argue that every journalist should actually be written about, because it forces you to recognize the human dimension of what it feels like on the other side.
And I think that's the thing. So you've become a brand, and people are going to say negative things about you.
Right.
And you hope they're the exception, not the rule. But if they never write anything else, that becomes the reputation.
Right.
Which is really what companies are dealing with. We are, it's a capitalist society. We live in the United States. I think we celebrate capitalism as an industry.
Right.
Journalists don't seem to like capitalism, really, although if they would not be employed but for capitalism. And it's sort of a frustrating thing. So no one celebrates business. No one celebrates the fact that we employ, we lend,
Right.
we make products, we help societies. It's only defined as the most negative. Now listen, I can say this because our industry really, I think, had the worst turn. And we participated in that. We were not victims. We participated in it. I would say it was over-reported on the negative. And a company like ours, where we had to jettison $50 billion worth of business, we simplified our products, we came out of the chaos, we make money today, the customer satisfaction scores are much better. Very little has been written about that.
Right. Well, let me say this, and I would not dissuade you from that view, but I also think that if you really were to look at the press, and not necessarily the banks, there's no question the banks have
Or car companies, automotive,
well, I would also argue that
energy.
just when General Motors had its moment to shine, all of a sudden it got back in the soup. But think about Apple. The coverage of Apple is remarkable. Think about the coverage of Tesla and Elon Musk. So it's not to say that I don't think that this country is celebrating capitalism or the American dream, but I think one of the things that's happened, and it's really how politicized things have become and how divided the country has been. I would argue to you that, at a time we talk about inequality in this country, there's sort of two American dreams that have developed. One is this American dream, which is sort of the Elon Musk, or even like call it the Horatio Alger American dream, which is to say that you can start from nothing and reach for the stars and shoot the moon, and it's a great success story. But I think there's this other American dream in this country, which is really what I might describe as the Leave It to Beaver American dream, which is sort of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s American dream, which was, if you tried hard, you'd go to school, if you graduate, you get a house, you get a husband or a wife and 2 kids and a dog, and everything was just supposed to sort of work out. And I think it's that dream that has become so challenged in this country, and that's why there is such an angst about it. Now, by the way, historically, you could argue, and I could argue, that that American dream is actually an aberration of history, too. All of the things that happened during that. And so the question is that a reasonable goal to return to, and can we get there? And if we don't get there, what does that mean to the way the country feels about big business and what it does for society?
Well, I think that's fair because the American psyche is built on middle class.
Right.
So if middle class America is dwindling, that's a problem. But when you have 5% unemployment and real wages are finally beginning to rise, that makes a difference. Right. That's when people can once again buy homes and have a lifestyle. So I do believe that without a lifestyle for a vast majority of middle class that should be attainable is attained, there'll be, a sense of polarization.
Right. I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, I think we're out of time, but I think we are about, in terms of where we are in the economy, whereas it's felt very negative for the past 7 years, I think we're about to turn the corner.
Yeah, I think that's whether you're looking at consumer index or anything else. We see it. We see it because we're constantly doing research with customers, and we see a more optimistic mindset. And of course, their real wages are finally beginning to improve.
On an optimistic note, let's leave it there. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Andrew.
Great. Appreciate it.